A millionaire rescues a black baby from a crash, but the child's birthmark hints at shocking family ties. What unexpected revelation will this mark bring to light? And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. Lucas Carter sat behind the wheel of his Mercedes S-Class, navigating through Manhattan's bustling streets on a Wednesday afternoon. The leather seat creaked as he shifted, checking his smartwatch for the third time in 10 minutes. As the CEO of Cart Tech Industries, every minute of his schedule was precisely calculated, and he was already running late for a board meeting where he would present their latest quantum computing breakthrough. The autumn sun glinted off the surrounding skyscrapers, many of which housed offices of companies that either partnered with or competed against Cart Tech. Lucas had built his empire from scratch, transforming a small software startup into a global technology powerhouse over 15 years. At 42, he had everything society deemed successful: wealth, power, influence. Yet he often found himself checking his phone compulsively, as if searching for something more. Traffic crawled forward on Fifth Avenue. Lucas's phone buzzed with an incoming text from his board chairman. The message preview showed urgent concerns about the presentation's financial projections. Despite knowing better, Lucas reached for his phone, his eyes darting between the screen and the road ahead. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, then red, but his attention remained split. The impact came without warning. The screech of brakes and crumpling metal filled the air as Lucas's Mercedes collided with a black sedan that had stopped for the light. His airbag deployed, filling his lungs with chemical dust. For several long seconds, Lucas sat stunned, his ears ringing from the collision's force. Then he heard it, a sound that would change his life forever. A baby's cry, weak but distinct, cut through the chaos of car horns and gathering onlookers. Lucas unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements automatic as he pushed open his damaged car door. The black sedan's front end was crushed, its driver unconscious but breathing. But the cry came from the back seat. Through the shattered rear window, Lucas spotted a baby carrier, partially ejected from its base. The infant inside wailed, her tiny fists waving in the air. Without hesitation, Lucas reached through the broken glass, ignoring the cuts on his hands as he worked to free the carrier. The baby's cries grew stronger, almost demanding, as if calling specifically to him. When he finally extracted her from the wreckage, Lucas noticed something extraordinary: a small, heart-shaped birthmark just below her left collarbone. The mark seemed to pulse with each of her cries, drawing his attention even as sirens approached in the distance. The baby's dark skin contrasted with her pink onesie, her eyes wide and alert despite the trauma she'd just endured. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but Lucas refused to release the baby to anyone except the paramedics. He insisted on riding in the ambulance to Mount Sinai Hospital, making calls to reschedule his board meeting while never taking his eyes off the infant. The paramedics worked efficiently, checking vital signs and securing the baby for transport. At the hospital, doctors performed a thorough examination while Lucas paced the waiting room. His assistant arrived with a change of clothes and paperwork requiring his signature, but Lucas waved them away. For the first time in years, his company wasn't his primary concern. He needed to know if the baby was okay. After what felt like hours, Dr. Sarachin emerged with news. The baby girl was remarkably unharmed, a miracle, given the severity of the crash. However, the driver of the black sedan, who they discovered was a social worker, had sustained serious injuries. The baby had been in transit to a foster home, her paperwork incomplete and her future uncertain. Lucas stood by the nursery window, watching the infant sleep peacefully in her hospital crib. The heart-shaped birthmark seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of resilience and fate. His phone buzzed continuously with messages about missed meetings and concerned shareholders, but for once, Lucas didn't feel compelled to respond. The weight of the day's events settled on his shoulders as he reflected on how close they'd both come to tragedy. His reckless behavior could have ended very differently. Yet here they both were, survivors of a moment that felt increasingly like destiny rather than accident. The baby stirred in her sleep, and Lucas made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. He would not leave her to an uncertain fate in the foster system. As he watched her peaceful breathing, Lucas realized that sometimes the most significant turning points in life arrive disguised as accidents. The thought of returning to his solitary existence in his penthouse suddenly seemed impossible. This tiny being, who had literally crashed into his life, had awakened something long dormant in his soul, the desire to be more than just a successful businessman. The marble floors of Lucas Carter's Upper East Side mansion echoed with unfamiliar sounds, the squeak of baby bottles being sterilized, the gentle humming of a newly installed mobile, and the whispered consultations with a team of childcare experts. 3 days after the accident, Lucas stood in what had once been his home office, now transformed into a state-of-the-art nursery, watching contractors install safety features with military precision. His decision to adopt the baby had sent shockwaves through New York's social circles. The tabloids alternated between painting him as a savior and questioning his motives. His board of directors called an emergency meeting, concerned about the company's image and his ability to maintain focus on their upcoming product launches. But Lucas remained unmoved. Something about the heart-shaped birthmark and the baby's resilient spirit had touched a part of him he didn't know existed. The adoption process moved with unprecedented speed, aided by his team of lawyers and his considerable influence. He named her Zara, inspired by the strength the name carried in multiple cultures. The social worker from the accident remained in critical condition, and no family had come forward to claim the child. Background checks revealed only fragments of information. She had been born in a small hospital in Georgia, and her mother had disappeared shortly after giving birth. Lucas approached fatherhood with the same methodical determination that had built his empire. He hired the city's best nanny, enrolled in parenting classes, and read every book on child development he could find. Yet in quiet moments, when Zara's tiny hand wrapped around his finger or her eyes tracked his movements across the room, all his carefully constructed plans dissolved into pure instinct. His executive assistant, Maria, watched this transformation with a mixture of concern and amusement. The man who once demanded minute-by-minute schedule updates now spent hours on the nursery floor, making silly faces at an infant. Board meetings were rescheduled around feeding times, and conference calls were occasionally interrupted by baby babbles through the baby monitor he refused to silence. One evening, as Lucas sat in the nursery's rocking chair with Zara sleeping against his chest, his attention was drawn to the heart-shaped birthmark. Under the soft lamplight, it seemed to shimmer with an almost iridescent quality. Acting on an impulse, he used his phone to photograph it, intending to research if such marks had any medical significance. The search led him to his family's library, a room he'd rarely visited since purchasing the mansion. As he scrolled through medical websites on his tablet, a leaf, bound book tumbled from an upper shelf, narrowly missing his head. The volume was old, its pages yellowed and brittle, with no author listed on its worn spine. Opening it carefully, Lucas found himself looking at a collection of family histories, photographs, and newspaper clippings. Many pages featured a recurring symbol, a heart-shaped mark identical to Zara's. His hands trembled as he turned to a photograph dated 1963, showing a young black woman addressing a crowd. On her collarbone, clearly visible despite the image's age, was the same distinctive birthmark. The woman's name was Grace Matthews, and according to the text accompanying the photo, she had been a pivotal figure in the civil rights movement, known for bringing together diverse communities in the fight for equality. Lucas had never heard of her, yet something about her eyes in the photograph struck him as familiar. As he read further, the book revealed a complex web of relationships between prominent families during the civil rights era. Grace Matthews had worked closely with several influential white allies, including, to his shock, members of his own family whom he'd never known about. The discovery sent him rushing to his study, where he began cross-referencing the information with his company's historical records. The night deepened as Lucas lost himself in research, his tablet forgotten beside him. Zara's baby monitor transmitted her steady breathing, a rhythmic soundtrack to his investigation. Each page turned revealed another layer of a history he'd never known existed, suggesting connections that seemed impossible yet were documented in fading ink and preserved photographs. When Maria arrived the next morning, she found him surrounded by papers and historical documents, Zara sleeping peacefully in a bassinet beside his desk. The look in his eyes told her that something fundamental had shifted. The man who had built his reputation on shaping the future had become consumed by the past, driven by a mystery that seemed to center on the sleeping infant who had so unexpectedly entered his life. The discovery of Grace Matthews' story consumed Lucas's days. Between managing Cart Tech and caring for Zara, he spent every spare moment in various historical archives throughout New York City. The book had opened a door to a past he never knew existed, revealing that his family's wealth hadn't come solely from technological innovation, but from a complex history of civil rights activism and corporate responsibility. Grace Matthews, he learned, had been more than just a civil rights leader. In 1963, she had founded the Matthews Foundation, an organization that provided educational opportunities for African American students in STEM fields. The foundation had worked closely with Carter Industries, Lucas's grandfather's company, which later evolved into Cart Tech. This partnership had remained hidden in the company's archives, buried beneath decades of corporate restructuring and carefully managed public relations. As Zara grew stronger each day, her heart-shaped birthmark becoming more pronounced, Lucas found himself drawing parallels between her and Grace. Both possessed a certain presence that commanded attention. Even at just a few months old, Zara's eyes held the same penetrating quality he'd noticed in Grace's photographs. He began taking Zara to predominantly Black neighborhoods in Harlem and Brooklyn, seeking connections to a community he'd previously ignored despite operating his business in their midst. During one such visit to a community center in Bed-Stuy, Lucas met elderly residents who remembered Grace Matthews firsthand. They shared stories of her fearlessness, how she would stand before city councils and corporate boards, demanding equal opportunities with a dignity that couldn't be dismissed. Some even recalled seeing her heart-shaped birthmark, considering it a symbol of her passionate dedication to justice. These conversations transformed Lucas's understanding of his own privilege and responsibility. He began implementing changes at Cart Tech, establishing diversity initiatives and revisiting hiring practices. His board members watched with growing concern as their CEO, once focused solely on profit margins, began speaking about social responsibility in shareholder meetings. It was during this period of transformation that Sophie Martinez entered the picture. An investigative journalist known for exposing corporate corruption, she had initially begun tracking Lucas's activities, expecting to find evidence of tax evasion or fraudulent business practices. Instead, she uncovered something far more intriguing: the sudden adoption of a Black infant by one of New York's most prominent white businessmen, followed by unprecedented changes in his company's social policies. Sophie's investigation led her through a labyrinth of public records, corporate filings, and social media posts. She noted how Lucas had withdrawn from his usual social circles, canceling appearances at tech conferences and charity galas. Instead, he was being spotted in historically Black neighborhoods, often with a baby carrier and a thoughtful expression that contradicted his former reputation as a ruthless tech mogul. The journalist in her recognized that something deeper was occurring than a simple PR stunt. Lucas Carter's transformation seemed genuine, but experience had taught her that genuine changes in powerful men often concealed even more significant truths. She began interviewing Cart Tech employees, documenting the subtle but meaningful shifts in company culture that had occurred since Zara's arrival. Through her research, Sophie discovered her own unexpected connection to the story. Her mentor at journalism school had been a civil rights historian who had extensively documented Grace Matthews' work. The professor had often spoken about a mysterious alliance between Matthews and certain white business leaders, but the details had remained elusive. Now, Sophie wondered if she had stumbled upon the missing pieces of that historical puzzle. As Lucas delved deeper into Grace's legacy, he remained unaware of Sophie's growing file on him. He focused on understanding the intersection between his family's past and his present responsibilities. Each night, as he put Zara to bed, he would trace the outline of her birthmark and wonder about the weight of history it seemed to carry. The corporate titan who had once measured success in stock prices and market share now found himself contemplating concepts like legacy, justice, and redemption. This parallel investigation, Lucas into his family's past and Sophie into his present, was building toward an inevitable collision. The truth about Grace Matthews, the significance of Zara's birthmark, and the real story behind the Carter family's wealth were pieces of a puzzle that neither could solve alone. Sophie Martinez's investigation into Lucas Carter took an unexpected turn when she uncovered financial records from the 1960s showing substantial transfers between Carter Industries and the Matthews Foundation. The amounts were significant even by today's standards, suggesting a relationship that went far beyond mere corporate philanthropy. She cross-referenced these transactions with civil rights-era documentation, building a timeline that revealed a pattern of coordinated activities between Grace Matthews and the Carter family. Through interviews with former Carter Industries employees, Sophie learned that Lucas's grandfather, William Carter, had maintained a private correspondence with Grace Matthews for nearly 2 decades. However, after Grace's mysterious disappearance in 1975, the Carter family had systematically distanced themselves from their civil rights connections, rebuilding their image as purely technology innovators. One former board member, speaking on condition of anonymity, described Lucas's previous reputation in stark terms. Carter was known for queering struggling tech companies, stripping them for patents, and discarding the human capital. This aggressive business strategy had earned him enemies, particularly in minority-owned businesses that had been disproportionately affected by his corporate raids. Sophie spent days examining Lucas's adoption of Zara, finding irregularities that raised ethical concerns. The process had moved with unusual speed, bypassing standard waiting periods and home studies. While everything appeared legally sound, the ease with which a single white man had acquired custody of a black infant struck many social workers as problematic. One adoption specialist confided, "In my 20 years of practice, I've never seen a cross-racial adoption process this quickly." The breakthrough in Sophie's investigation came when she discovered an archived file in the city records office. The file contained correspondence between Grace Matthews and William Carter regarding a trust fund established for future generations of the Matthews lineage. The trust had specific provisions about birthmarks, describing them as physical manifestations of our shared covenant. This discovery led Sophie to question whether Lucas's adoption of Zara was truly coincidental. Had he known about the birthmark's significance? Was this elaborate corporate transformation an attempt to fulfill some historical obligation, or was there a deeper mystery at play? The journalist in her recognized that she was no longer just investigating potential corporate misconduct. She was unraveling a generational story that challenged assumptions about race, power, and responsibility. Meanwhile, Lucas faced growing scrutiny from his board of directors. The company's pivot towards social responsibility initiatives had affected quarterly profits, and shareholders were becoming restless. His rival, James Morrison of Morrison Tech, began circulating rumors about Carter's mental stability, suggesting that the adoption of Zara was evidence of a guilt-driven breakdown. Sophie's research revealed that Morrison's own company had benefited from the systematic dismantling of minority-owned tech firms during the 1990s, many of which had been supported by the Matthews Foundation. The connection seemed too precise to be coincidental, suggesting a decades-long corporate vendetta against Grace Matthews' legacy of empowerment. The ethical implications of Lucas's adoption of Zara became more complex as Sophie uncovered layers of historical context. Was he inadvertently perpetuating a white savior narrative, or was there a legitimate historical connection that justified his actions? The heart-shaped birthmark, documented in both Grace's photographs and present on Zara's skin, seemed to suggest a biological connection that transcended racial boundaries. Through careful investigation, Sophie discovered that the social worker involved in the accident had been researching similar cases of children with distinctive birthmarks being adopted into wealthy families. The worker's notes, recovered from the crashed vehicle, contained references to both the Matthews Foundation and Carter Industries, suggesting she had been close to uncovering the same historical connection that Sophie now pursued. As public interest in the story grew, Sophie noticed a pattern of intimidation emerging. Sources became reluctant to speak, documents mysteriously disappeared from public archives, and her editor reported pressure from advertisers to abandon the investigation. These attempts at suppression only convinced her that she was approaching a truth that powerful people wanted to remain hidden. This complex web of historical connections, corporate interests, and ethical questions surrounding Zara's adoption was building toward a confrontation that would force both Lucas and Sophie to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, responsibility, and the true meaning of family legacy. The annual CartTech Shareholders Gala transformed the METR Opolitan Museum of Art into a showcase of technological innovation and corporate power. Lucas Carter stood at the podium, Zara sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside him, as he prepared to deliver the most significant speech of his career. The past 6 months had shifted CartTech's direction dramatically. Their new initiative to fund minority-owned tech startups and establish STEM education programs in underserved communities had cut into profits, but generated unprecedented social impact. James Morrison sat in the front row, his presence a silent challenge. Earlier that week, Morrison had sent Lucas a private message containing photographs from Grace Matthews' last known appearance in 1975, along with documentation suggesting that Carter Industries had played a role in her disappearance. The implicit threat was clear: back away from the new corporate direction, or face a scandal that would destroy both his reputation and his company's legacy. Lucas felt the weight of his grandfather's choices pressing down on him as he surveyed the crowd. The company's major shareholders watched with barely concealed skepticism as he began discussing CartTech's new direction. "Technology isn't just about innovation," he declared, his voice steady despite his internal turmoil. "It's about accessibility, about ensuring that the future we're building reflects all of humanity, not just those privileged enough to shape it." As he spoke, protesters gathered outside the museum. Their signs demanded accountability for CartTech's historical practices of acquiring and dismantling minority-owned businesses. The irony wasn't lost on Lucas. His attempt to right historical wrongs had exposed deeper wounds in the community he was trying to help. Zara stirred in her carrier, her heart-shaped birthmark visible beneath her party dress, a constant reminder of the legacy he had unknowingly inherited. The pressure from his board had reached a critical point. They presented him with an ultimatum: either return the company to its profit-focused trajectory or face a vote of no confidence. Several board members had already aligned with Morrison, who promised to maintain CartTech's market dominance by abandoning what he called social justice distractions. During his speech, Lucas revealed CartTech's plans to establish the Grace Matthews Technology Initiative, committing $1 billion to support Black entrepreneurs in the tech sector. The announcement sent immediate shockwaves through the audience. Share prices began dropping in after-hours trading, and Morrison's allies started texting their brokers. But for the first time in his career, Lucas found himself measuring success in terms beyond market value. The gala's carefully orchestrated schedule dissolved into chaos when a group of civil rights activists gained entry. Their leader, an elderly woman who introduced herself as a former colleague of Grace Matthews, approached the podium. Instead of joining the protest, she stood silently, studying Zara's birthmark with tears in her eyes. The entire room watched as she reached into her purse and withdrew a faded photograph showing Grace Matthews holding a baby with an identical mark. Lucas's security team moved to intervene, but he waved them back. In that moment, watching the elderly activist's reaction to Zara, he realized that his choice wasn't really between his company and his adopted daughter. The real decision was whether to continue hiding from history or to embrace the complicated truth of his family's legacy. The speech he had carefully prepared remained unfinished on the podium as he began speaking from his heart about responsibility, redemption, and the true cost of progress. The protesters fell silent, smartphones recording every word as Lucas Carter, the tech mogul known for ruthless efficiency, publicly grappled with questions of privilege and purpose. But before he could finish, Morrison approached the stage, holding up his phone displaying an email. He threatened to send to every major news outlet documents suggesting that Lucas's grandfather had orchestrated Grace Matthews' disappearance to prevent her from exposing corporate misconduct. The gala descended into murmurs and shocked expressions as Lucas faced the ultimate choice between protecting his family's secrets and honoring the truth that Zara's birthmark demanded he acknowledge. The chaos at the gala created the perfect opportunity for Sophie Martinez to finally approach Lucas Carter. As security personnel attempted to restore order, she navigated through the crowd, press credentials visible, but her intent far beyond mere journalism. She found Lucas in a quiet corner of the museum's Egyptian wing, sitting on a bench with Zara sleeping against his chest, the evening's turmoil seemingly distant from their peaceful tableau. "Mr. Carter," Sophie spoke softly, mindful of the sleeping child. "I've spent months investigating your connection to Grace Matthews, but I think we both know there's more to this story than what's in my notes." She placed a worn leather journal on the bench between them. Grace Matthews' personal diary, recovered from a university archive through months of painstaking research. Lucas studied Sophie's face, recognizing the same determination he'd seen in photographs of Grace Matthews. The journal's presence seemed to shift the air around them, as if the weight of history had suddenly become tangible. "How much do you know?" he asked, unconsciously tracing the outline of Zara's birthmark through her dress. Sophie pulled out her tablet, displaying a complex timeline she'd constructed. "Your grandfather and Grace Matthews weren't just business associates. They were partners in a secret initiative to integrate the tech industry decades before diversity became a corporate buzzword. But something went wrong in 1975. Grace disappeared, and the Carter family began systematically erasing their connection to her work. The revelation of the letter sparked an intense discussion between them. Lucas shared the book he'd discovered in his library, while Sophie revealed the patterns she'd uncovered in her investigation. Together, they began piecing together a narrative that had been deliberately fragmented and buried. The heart-shaped birthmark, they realized, wasn't just a coincidence. It was a genetic marker that Grace had documented in her research, appearing in individuals she believed were destined to continue her work. "Morrison doesn't just want to stop your company's new direction," Sophie explained, showing Lucas documents she'd uncovered. "He's trying to prevent the fulfillment of a promise made generations ago." Grace Matthews and William Carter established a trust that would fundamentally reshape the technology industry's power structure, but it could only be activated by the reunion of their bloodlines. As they talked, Zara awoke, her tiny fingers reaching for the journal as if drawn to it. The baby's gesture caused both adults to pause, watching as she touched the worn leather with unusual focus. Sophie reached into her bag and withdrew a final piece of evidence, a DNA test she'd run comparing Zara's genetic markers to those documented in Grace's research. The results confirmed what they had begun to suspect. Zara wasn't just any child who happened to share Grace's birthmark. She represented the convergence of two family lines that had been forcibly separated decades ago. The accident that brought her into Lucas's life wasn't an accident at all. It was the culmination of a plan set in motion before either of them was born. Lucas and Sophie spent hours in that quiet corner of the museum, their conversation moving from professional distance to shared purpose. They discovered that their separate investigations had been leading them to the same conclusion, that the true story wasn't about corporate politics or racial dynamics, but about fulfilling a legacy of unity that their predecessors had envisioned. As the night deepened and museum staff began turning off lights in distant galleries, they made a decision. Morrison's threats and the board's ultimatum would have to be confronted, but not through traditional corporate warfare. Grace Matthews had left them a blueprint for something more revolutionary, a way to transform not just cart tech, but the entire landscape of technological innovation and social justice. The following days transformed Sophie's apartment into an impromptu investigation headquarters. Documents covered every surface, with red strings connecting photographs, newspaper clippings, and corporate records across her living room walls. Lucas would arrive each evening after putting Zara to bed, her nanny monitoring the baby monitor feed while they worked to unravel decades of carefully hidden connections. Sophie discovered a startling personal link when examining her mother's old correspondence. A yellowed envelope contained photographs of her mother standing alongside Grace Matthews at a civil rights demonstration in 1974. The images showed both women outside Carter Industries' original headquarters, Grace's heart-shaped birthmark visible as she addressed a crowd. Sophie's mother, Elena Martinez, held a sign demanding equal opportunities in technology careers. "My mother never told me about this," Sophie whispered, her fingers trembling as she showed Lucas the photographs. "She encouraged my interest in investigative journalism, but she always steered me away from corporate corruption stories. Now I understand why." The weight of this revelation settled between them. Sophie's pursuit of this story wasn't just professional curiosity, it was encoded in her own family history. Their research revealed that Elena Martinez had been part of Grace Matthews' Inner Circle, a group of women from diverse backgrounds who worked to create pathways for minorities in the emerging technology sector. Elena had been the last person to see Grace alive on the night she disappeared. According to Sophie's mother's diary, Grace had been excited about a breakthrough in negotiations with William Carter, but she never arrived at their scheduled meeting the next morning. As Lucas and Sophie delved deeper, they began receiving anonymous threats. Their phones showed signs of sophisticated hacking attempts, and Sophie's apartment was broken into, though nothing was stolen. The intruders had instead left something, an old photograph placed conspicuously on her desk, showing Grace Matthews with a group of children, all bearing the distinctive heart-shaped birthmark. Their investigation led them to a retired nurse who had worked in the maternity ward where Zara was born. The nurse remembered the birth clearly, not just because of the birthmark, but because of the unusual circumstances. A woman had arrived in advanced labor, refusing to provide identification. After delivering the baby, she had disappeared, leaving only a sealed envelope addressed to the Carter family. The envelope, which the nurse had kept safe all these months, contained a letter that brought tears to Lucas's eyes. Written in Grace Matthews' distinctive handwriting, dated just before her disappearance, it detailed a plan spanning generations. She had foreseen attempts to dismantle her work and had ensured that her legacy would resurface when the time was right, marked by the birth of a child bearing the family birthmark. While processing this information, Sophie received an urgent call from her mother. Elena Martinez, now living in a retirement community in Florida, had been visited by men claiming to represent Morrison Tech. They had asked questions about Grace Matthews and made veiled threats about Sophie's safety. Instead of frightening Elena, the encounter had strengthened her resolve. She revealed to Sophie that she possessed Grace's original research journals, hidden away for decades in anticipation of this moment. The alliance between Lucas and Sophie evolved. Beyond their professional collaboration, they began sharing meals, their conversations flowing from strategy sessions into personal revelations. Lucas opened up about his lonely childhood in the shadow of the Carter legacy, while Sophie shared stories of her mother's subtle activism, recognizing now how Elena had prepared her for this very investigation. Meanwhile, Zara thrived, seeming to sense the importance of their work. During late-night research sessions, she would watch them intently from her portable crib in Sophie's living room, her birthmark sometimes appearing to pulse with a subtle glow under the lamplight. The baby's presence served as a constant reminder of what was at stake, not just corporate policies or historical records, but the fulfillment of a vision that had cost Grace Matthews her freedom and possibly her life. Lucas transformed the top floor of Cartech's headquarters into a memorial exhibition dedicated to Grace Matthews' work in technology and civil rights. The space featured interactive displays chronicling the forgotten history of minority contributions to the tech industry, with Grace's heart-shaped birthmark incorporated subtly into the exhibition's logo. The centerpiece was a wall of photographs showing technology pioneers from diverse backgrounds, many of whose companies had been absorbed by larger corporations during the industry's consolidation in the 1990s. Sophie's investigative article, published in The Atlantic, sent shockwaves through the technology sector. Titled The Heart of Innovation, The Buried History of America's First Integrated Tech Company, the piece meticulously documented how Grace Matthews and William Carter had created a blueprint for corporate diversity decades ahead of their time. The article stopped short of revealing Zara's connection to Grace, protecting the child while still exposing the systematic erasure of this historical partnership. The response from Morrison Tech was swift and aggressive. James Morrison launched a counter-campaign, releasing documents that appeared to show Grace Matthews had embezzled funds from Carter Industries before her disappearance. These documents, Sophie quickly proved, had been cleverly fabricated. The clumsy attempt at character assassination only lent credibility to their investigation. Karteka's board members found themselves in an uncomfortable spotlight. Several resigned when journalists began investigating their connections to the systematic dismantling of minority-owned tech companies in the 1990s. Those who remained faced uncomfortable questions about their commitment to the company's new direction. Lucas used this opportunity to restructure the board, appointing members recommended by Grace's former colleagues. The exhibition became a rallying point for tech industry reform. Young entrepreneurs and veteran programmers alike visited, many sharing their own stories of discrimination and erasure. Lucas established a foundation, separate from Kartek, dedicated to preserving these narratives and providing support for minority-owned startups. The initiative quickly gained support from unexpected allies, smaller tech companies that had survived the industry's consolidation phase. However, the pressure on Lucas intensified. Morrison Tech launched a hostile takeover attempt, leveraging the temporary dip in Karteka's stock price following the exhibition's opening. Major clients, particularly those uncomfortable with the company's new social justice stance, began moving their contracts to competitors. Lucas faced the real possibility of losing control of the company his family had built. Sophie's research uncovered a pattern of suspicious accidents befalling people who had tried to tell Grace's story over the years. The social worker involved in the crash that brought Zara to Lucas had been investigating similar cases. This revelation suggested a decades-long conspiracy to suppress not just the history, but the very possibility of integration in the tech industry's upper echelons. During this period, Lucas and Sophie worked to protect their growing network of sources. They established secure communication channels for whistleblowers and created digital dead drops for sensitive information. The exhibition itself contained hidden messages for those who knew where to look, dates, locations, and names that could help others piece together the full scope of Grace's vision. The climax of their public campaign approached with the announcement of the Grace Matthews Technology Summit, scheduled to coincide with the anniversary of her disappearance. The event would bring together industry leaders, civil rights activists, and emerging innovators from underrepresented communities. Morrison and his allies scrambled to prevent what they recognized as a fundamental challenge to their power structure. As preparations for the summit intensified, Lucas received one final threat from Morrison: evidence that Grace Matthews had not disappeared voluntarily in 1975, but had been involved in an incident directly connected to the current Carter family fortune. The implication was clear: continue down this path, and the truth about Grace's fate would destroy both Lucas's reputation and his ability to protect Zara's future. The Grace Matthews Technology Summit transformed Karteka's headquarters into a convergence of past and present. The grand lobby featured interactive displays highlighting the parallel histories of civil rights and technological innovation, while conference rooms hosted panels on diversity in tech leadership. Lucas stood at the center of it all, Zara in his arms, as hundreds of industry leaders and activists filled the auditorium. Morrison arrived early, flanked by lawyers and carrying a thick folder of documents. His confident smirk suggested he believed this would be the day he finally destroyed Lucas Carter's reputation. As the opening ceremonies began, he positioned himself prominently in the front row, occasionally glancing at his phone as if awaiting a signal. Sophie had spent the previous night reviewing Elena's final revelations about Grace's disappearance. Her mother had finally shared a safety deposit box key, leading to a cache of documents Grace had prepared in case anything happened to her. The contents painted a devastating picture. Grace had discovered that Carter Industries' early success relied partly on stolen innovations from Black inventors, but rather than expose this publicly, she and William Carter had worked secretly to create a trust that would eventually restore control to the descendants of those wronged. As Lucas began his keynote address, Morrison stood up, interrupting with a theatrical flourish. Before Mr. Carter continues his performance as social justice warrior, he announced, "The public deserves to know the truth about Grace Matthews." He projected onto the screen what appeared to be a police report suggesting Grace had been caught stealing corporate secrets before she vanished. However, Sophie was ready. She took the stage, armed with Grace's original documents and the results of a comprehensive investigation. "Mr. Morrison," she declared, her voice steady, I believe you're working from incomplete information." She proceeded to reveal the full story. Grace hadn't disappeared. She had been placed in protective custody after uncovering a conspiracy to prevent minority advancement in the tech industry, a conspiracy that Morrison's own father had helped orchestrate. The audience sat stunned as Sophie displayed evidence that Morrison Tech's rise to prominence had been built on systematically suppressing innovations from minority-owned companies, using the same tactics that had forced Grace into hiding. But the most shocking revelation came when Sophie introduced her final witness, an elderly woman who walked slowly to the stage, her collar slightly open to reveal a familiar heart-shaped birthmark. This woman wasn't Grack E. Matthews, but her sister, Mary, who had helped maintain the network of families marked by the distinctive birthmark. She explained that the mark wasn't just a coincidence, but a genetic trait that appeared in children descended from a group of innovators who had worked together during the Reconstruction era, forming one of America's first integrated technology cooperatives. Lucas stood motionless as Mary approached Zara, tears in her eyes. "Your grandfather," she said to Lucas, "didn't just work with Grace. They created a plan to right historical wrongs, but they knew it would take generations to fulfill. This child," she touched Zara's birthmark gently, "is the proof that their vision is finally coming to fruition." Morrison's attempted exposure had backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying Lucas's credibility, he had provided the perfect platform for revealing the deeper truth about the tech industry's troubled history with race and innovation. The documents he had planned to use against Lucas now served as evidence of his own family's involvement in suppressing minority advancement in technology. As the summit's attendees processed these revelations, Lucas made an unprecedented announcement. CartTech would be restructured under a new model of corporate governance, with leadership shared between traditional stakeholders and representatives from historically marginalized communities. The Grace Matthews Trust, dormant for decades, would finally serve its intended purpose, funding the restoration of stolen innovations to their rightful heirs. The aftermath of the summit's revelations transformed what had begun as a corporate scandal into a watershed moment for the technology industry. In the quiet of Lucas's home office, as the sun set over Manhattan, Sophie arranged the final pieces of evidence that would complete their understanding of Zara's true identity. Elena Martinez arrived carrying a weathered metal box she had guarded for decades. Inside lay Grace Matthews' final letter, written the night before her disappearance. The letter revealed that Grace had foreseen everything: the attempt to erase her legacy, the eventual birth of a child bearing the heart-shaped mark, and the reunion of the Carter and Matthews bloodlines. But the most stunning revelation was about Zara's mother. Grace had established a network of families, all descendants of the original Reconstruction-era technology cooperative. These families had maintained their connections in secret, passing down not just the distinctive birthmark, but also a profound understanding of innovation and social justice. Zara's mother, it turned out, was Sarah Matthews, Grace's granddaughter, who had deliberately orchestrated the accident that brought her daughter into Lucas's life. Sarah emerged from hiding, entering Lucas's office with the quiet dignity that characterized Grace's photographs. She explained how she had discovered her pregnancy coincided with Lucas taking control of CartTech. Understanding the significance of the timing, she had planned every detail, ensuring her daughter would carry the birthmark and finding a way to place her in Lucas's path without revealing their connection. The accident wasn't an accident, Sarah explained, touching Zara's birthmark. It was the fulfillment of a plan 3 generations in the making. Grace and William Carter knew their initial attempts at integration would face violent opposition. They created a failsafe, a future generation that would unite their families and fulfill their vision of true equality and innovation. Lucas struggled to process this information, seeing his entire life through a new lens. His grandfather's insistence that he study technology, his inexplicable drive to succeed in the tech industry, and his instant connection to Zara, all had been parts of a plan he hadn't known he was fulfilling. The heart-shaped birthmark wasn't just a genetic marker. It was a symbol of resistance and hope, passed down through generations of innovators who had refused to let their contributions be erased. Sophie, whose own mother had been part of this intricate plan, understood now why she had been drawn to investigate Lucas. The story she had pursued wasn't just about corporate misconduct or historical injustice. It was about the reunification of families torn apart by prejudice and power, brought together by a shared commitment to progress. The implications extended far beyond cart tech. Other companies, led by descendants of the original cooperative members, began emerging from the shadows, revealing similar stories of hidden innovations and preserved legacies. The heart-shaped birthmark appeared in photographs and paintings dating back to the Civil War, always marking those who sought to bridge racial and social divides through technological advancement. Lucas and Sarah agreed to raise Zara together, combining the resources of the Carter Empire with the wisdom of the Matthews legacy. The child would grow up knowing both sides of her heritage, the privilege that came with the Carter name and the responsibility inherited from Grace Matthews' sacrifice. Carteca's transformation became a model for corporate evolution. The company established the Grace Matthews Institute for Technological Equity, with Sarah as its director and Sophie heading its investigative division. The institute's mission was twofold: to restore credit and compensation to families whose innovations had been appropriated, and to ensure that future technological advancement would be truly inclusive. As Lucas watched Zara fall asleep that night, her birthmark seeming to pulse with the same determination he had seen in Grace's photographs, he understood that his journey from tech magnate to social justice advocate had been predetermined by forces greater than himself. The heart-shaped mark that had brought them together was more than a genetic quirk. It was a reminder that true innovation could only flourish when built on a foundation of justice and equality. The story of Lucas Carter and Zara Matthews Carter became legend in Silicon Valley, not just as a tale of corporate redemption, but as proof that the past is never truly buried. The legacy of Grace Matthews lived on, not only in the physical mark she had passed down through generations, but in the transformed landscape of an industry that had finally begun to acknowledge and repair its historical debts.